Now let's talk about JavaScript's characteristics. Now JavaScript is a programming language, but it has a few characteristics. So what are they and what do they mean? For example, when we looked at the description of the JavaScript programming language at the very start of this video, there were a lot of characteristics and you might not know what they all mean. So let's break down some of them in this video right now. First, we'll talk about high-level programming languages versus low-level programming languages. Now, JavaScript is a high-level programming language, but what's the difference? What's the difference between a high-level programming language and a low-level programming language? Well, a high-level programming language is a programming language that is more or less independent of a type of computer or hardware the code is written in, which means you can actually write this code in one type of computer and run it or execute it in another type of computer. So the code itself is not specifically tied to any computer, architecture, or set of hardware. It can run on a wide range of hardwares and devices, and this is called a high-level programming language. High-level programming languages such as JavaScript are closer to human languages. On the other hand, we have low-level programming languages. The assembly language and machine languages are good examples of low-level programming languages. These low-level programming languages are mostly dependent on a specific type of hardware or architecture to run their code on, which means when you write the code on a specific computer, you have to write the code for that specific set of hardware or hardware architecture. And most of the time, you can't take the same code and run it on a completely different type of computer. In order to do that, you first have to convert the code or modify it in some way. And that's because low-level programming languages are very dependent on a specific computer, hardware, device, or architecture. And the code itself is often written for a specific type of architecture or hardware only. And the same code can't run on many other types of hardware. This is in contrast to high-level programming languages, where you can write the code on a computer with an Intel processor, for example, and execute the same code on another computer with an AMD processor. Or, for example, you can write the code on a computer and execute it on a mobile device, such as a smartphone, where the architecture and the set of hardware are completely different. But for high-level programming languages, it doesn't matter, because high-level programming languages are very independent from a specific type of hardware. And JavaScript is a high-level programming language, which in a way is very good and very convenient. Because with JavaScript, because it's a high-level programming language, you can write the code in one computer, and the same code can be executed on a wide range of computers, devices, and set of hardwares. This makes development a lot easier because you don't have to write code separately for different types of hardware that you need to support. You can just write the JavaScript code once, and the same code can be ran and executed on different types of hardware. And that's what a high-level programming language means. And JavaScript itself is a high-level programming language. Now let's talk about interpreted programming languages versus compiled programming languages. Now JavaScript again is an interpreted programming language. An interpreted programming language is a programming language where the commands, instructions, or statements are executed more freely and directly by the implementation of the language. It doesn't need to be converted or otherwise translated into another type of language. The code is usually executed by an interpreter, and the interpreter interprets the code line by line and executes it. This is in contrast to compiled programming languages. With compiled programming languages, the code must first be compiled or converted into a somewhat different language before it can actually be executed. A good example of a compiled programming language would be Java. Now Java code isn't usually executed directly, but instead is first compiled into another language called bytecode, and this bytecode is what's actually executed. So with a programming language like Java, after you write the code, you first have to compile it into a different type of language, and then that compiled code can be executed by the implementation of the language. However, with interpreted languages, you usually don't need to compile it into a different language first. You can just write the code, and then that code can mostly be executed directly and freely by the implementation of the code. It doesn't need to be converted or compiled into a different type of code. So JavaScript is an interpreted programming language, which means you don't need to compile the code into a different type of language first before you can actually execute it. We can just write the code in a code editor, and the statements or instructions inside the code can mostly be executed directly and freely by the browser at runtime. It doesn't need to be compiled first. Now JavaScript is actually also a JIT compiled language. Now JIT compilers, or just-in-time compilers, compile the code just in time, or in most cases in real time. But for now, you can think of JavaScript as mostly being an interpreted language and not a compiled language. Now there are actually advantages and disadvantages to both interpreted and compiled programming languages. For example, interpreted programming languages have the advantage that they are very easy to write because they don't need to be compiled into something different first. You can just write them and the code can be executed more or less directly and freely. They don't need to be compiled into something different first. However, the same feature comes with a downside is that interpreted programming languages often have a higher chance of errors and bugs residing in the code. Because the code is interpreted and executed at runtime, if there's a bug or error in the code, you won't be able to find it until the execution reaches that point. And when it does, it'll usually throw a dynamic error, which sometimes might be hard to find or otherwise annoying. Compiled programming languages solve this problem by compiling the language into a different language first. So in this case, if there's an error in your code, you'll usually find it at compile time. So when you go to compile your code, usually the error will be thrown, and you'll be able to find it and fix it before the code even gets compiled. So this has a better guarantee that the compiled code will be mostly error-free and bug-free. However, it also comes with the downside that compiled programming languages sometimes are a bit complex to work on and sometimes take a long time to actually implement. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both types of programming languages. Now, JavaScript is also a lightweight programming language. A lightweight programming language means a programming language that is designed to have a very low or small memory footprint. It shouldn't require a lot of memory to be ran and executed. And it also means that the code syntax should be minimalistic, simple, and it should be easy to write and implement. So JavaScript is an example of a lightweight programming language. And thus we have a simplistic syntax and set of features, and also the language is very flexible.